Welcome everybody to video number 25 in our presentation of Acts 28, the great dispensational divide. That point in the New Testament where there was a change in the purposes of God. Up until Acts 28, we had a fulfillment of all that the festive calendar given to Israel represented or anticipated. In the Gospels we read about Passover. In the Acts period we read about Pentecost. And Pentecost, the jurisdiction thereof, continued right through the book of Acts, up until Acts 28, when the nation of Israel and these wonderful purposes for the redemption of all people on the earth through Abraham's great and mighty nation were put aside, postponed, and a new dispensation of the grace of God was revealed to Paul alone. Now we're going to pause the video at this point and go back and look at these feasts again and God's purposes for the earth, remembering that between Pentecost and trumpets there was a postponement. Well everybody, we've taken away the Acts 28 divide. And what we're seeing here in the festive calendar is God's purpose for redemption for all people on the earth. That redemptive purpose shown forth in creation when the enemy brought in through the disobedience of Adam sin and death, that purpose of redemption was tied to Israel's festive calendar through the weekly Sabbath. The seventh day God ceased from his labours, Genesis chapter 2. The Sabbath in a context where Adam and Eve were covered with coats of skin. And in Genesis 4 there was an appointed time where Cain and Abel brought offerings to the Lord. And Abel brought the firstlings of his flock, shed blood, redemption. And all the creation story, in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth, comes to a wonderful conclusion at the Feast of Tabernacles. And that anticipates the close of Scripture, Revelation 21. And I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth were passed away, and there was no more sea. And I, John, saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down from God out of heaven, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a great voice out of heaven saying, Behold, the tabernacle of God is with men, and he will dwell with them. What, in heaven? No, on the earth. He will dwell with them, and they shall be his people, and God himself shall be with them, and be their God, and God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes. A quote from Isaiah. Here we have this festive calendar featuring the Feast of Tabernacles, when the Lord dwells on that mercy seat in the holy place, anticipating the great New Jerusalem that will descend to the earth. And here's a very interesting thing, something we might like to consider. In Genesis chapter 4, there are a couple of little hints that might cause us a little bit of speculation. In Genesis 4, as I have said in verse 3, in the process of time, Cain and Abel brought. So there was a set time for these offerings, just as there was a set time in the law for the nation of Israel. In verse 4 we have the sin offering in verse 7 rather, sin lies at the door. The word for sin is found later in the law for sin offering. Now what door was it? Was it the door of your heart, the sin crouching? Well, this word for door is featured later in the Pentateuch, referring to the door where the sin offering was brought for the dedication of the priests, and also where the offerings were brought to be slaughtered on the Day of Atonement. So we have a door, we have a specific time, and remember we have that wonderful verse in Genesis 3:24. It says this, "So he drove out the man, and he placed at the east of the Garden of Eden cherubims and a flaming sword, which turned every way to keep the way of the tree of life." Jameson, Fawcett and Brown translate it like this, "And he dwelt between the cherubim." Who dwelt? The Lord, who previously walked in the garden with Adam and Eve. He dwelt between the cherubim at the east of the Garden of Eden, and a fierce fire, or Shekinah, unfolding itself to preserve the way of the tree of life. Back in Genesis 3, God dwelt between the cherubim, a pledge of restoration, Shekinah glory, and there was a sin offering and a door and an appointed time. I wonder if Revelation and the New Jerusalem actually is the fulfillment of a building that existed way back in Genesis 1 through 4, but just something for you to think about. Well now, isn't it a wonderful thing that this redemptive purpose that starts in Genesis and that follows through for the earth through the seed of Abram and is found in the festive calendar? This is God's purpose for the earth. Shed blood in the offering of Abel. Shed blood in the sacrificial system of the law. All pointing to the one who would bring deliverance at Passover and bring redemption for all the world. But what principle of exegesis is it which says that all the Old Testament, which is a theme for redemption for the earth, as soon as we get to the Gospels and we see Christ dying on the cross, all of a sudden it's about heaven? "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the heavenly places," the Lord said in Matthew 5, yes? "Our Father which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, in heaven as it is on earth." I don't think so. Do you see where Christianity has stumbled? When we see Christ dying on the cross at Passover, well, it's all about heaven now. Whereas from Genesis to Malachi, it's been about God's purposes of redemption through shed blood for the earth. What right do we have to change it when Passover in the Old Testament delivered Israel and brought about judgment for the gods of Egypt, and suddenly interpret it as being redemption for believers going to heaven? Now then, as we go through these festive calendars in more detail, we're going to find this emphasis being shed blood redemption in the earth. I want to remind us all that when Abraham was justified by his faith, that there was a statement following. You know, it's an amazing thing. We as Christians want to focus intently on Genesis 15 verse 6. "And he believed in the Lord, and he counted it to him for righteousness." Abraham believed the Lord's statement about his descendants, and he was justified by that faith through the grace of God. What's the next verse say? You know, when we come to the New Testament, and particularly the period covered by the book of Acts, when Pentecost was fulfilled, we're going to find Paul writing in Galatians and Romans about justification by faith. Oh, well, there you are then. Well, we're all going to heaven. But friends, in Genesis 15, which Paul quotes in Galatians 3 and Romans chapter 4, what's the next verse say? "And the Lord said unto Abram, and he said unto him, I am the Lord that brought thee out of Ur of the Chaldees to give thee this land to inherit it." Justification by faith, shed blood redemption, typified at Passover, has to do with redemption for the entire world through this man and his offspring. And that offspring was Christ, who died on that cross at Passover. But that didn't mean that this purpose changed and all of a sudden it's about the church all going to heaven. Do you see how important Acts 28 is here between the fulfillment of these two feasts? I hope you're beginning to see that as we go along. Now then, briefly in Exodus chapter 12, We'll have a look at Passover in just a couple of verses. In Exodus 12, remember, the Lord had said to Abram he would make of him a great and mighty nation, and through him all families of the earth would be blessed. Remember that? All families of the earth. The tabernacle in Isaiah 57 is called a house of prayer for all people. Galatians chapter 12. Exodus chapter 12. We have Passover, and in verse 6, "And you shall keep the Passover until the 14th day of the same month, and the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it in the evening." How many lambs? One lamb described as it, and it was killed in the evening. And this has to do with Israel's deliverance and the redemption of the world through the nation. Remember that when we read the Gospels. Now in verse 12 it says, "For I will pass over," or pass through, "the land of Egypt this night, and I will smite all the firstborn of the land of Egypt, both man and beast. And against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am the Lord." Verse 13, "And the blood shall be to you for a token upon the houses where you are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and the plague shall not be upon you to destroy you when I smite the land of Egypt." Blood on the door, same door as Genesis chapter 4 verse 7, same original Hebrew word. God passes over. Oh well, there you are, the blood saved them. But it's a purpose for the earth. Don't lose the fact that it's a purpose for the earth when we get to the Gospels. "And Israel were to observe this," verse 14, "and this day shall be unto you for a memorial, and you shall keep it a feast to the Lord throughout your generations. You shall keep it a feast by an ordinance forever." In the Old Testament, when Passover came about for the nation of Israel, they had a meal to eat as a memorial. And in the New Testament, when the disciples met with the Lord, He gave them that same Passover meal to observe as a memorial until He comes to the earth. Do you see the parallels? That's the Passover. Unleavened bread is in verse 15. 7 days shall you eat unleavened bread, Exodus 12. "Even the first day you shall put away leaven out of your houses. For whosoever eateth leavened bread from the first day until the 7th day, that soul shall be cut off from Israel." Unleavened bread is a wonderful, typical symbol of separation from sin and from Gentile dominion for the nation of Israel. They were brought out of Egypt. Unleavened bread speaks about separation from sin, but remember, they were brought out of Egypt. It's deliverance from Israel from Gentile dominion. Oh, we forget that bit when we think about sin and sins being put away. What's this purpose? The earth and redemption therein. Verse 17, "And ye shall observe the feast of unleavened bread, says the Lord to Moses, to Israel. For in this selfsame day have I brought your armies out of the land of Egypt. Therefore shall you observe this day." Isn't it wonderful when Cleopas and his friend were walking along that road to Emmaus, and they were downcast because they thought that the Lord was the one that was going to nationally redeem Israel. I wonder why they felt like that. They felt like that because that's what the feast events typified. And he didn't say, "Oh no, I'm starting the church now, chaps, you've got it all wrong." He said, no, you had to learn first all that the Scripture said, which included suffering first, then glory for the Lord on the earth in the tabernacle, and the restoration of the kingdom. Don't read the Gospels and think, oh, the church has started. No, it has not. It's all the church Israel and those to be blessed with her. Now I'm going to pause now, and I'll pick up in the next video, go through these final feasts before we look at them in detail, and the Lord bless you as you begin to see that the Gospels are about a purpose and a plan that was set forth in this pattern in the Old Testament, and if we forget the pattern, we're going to have a mess. Or perhaps 3,500 Christian denominations, which is precisely what we have at the moment.